QuakeCon. So we got the 1 hour flash there, so I'm going to move into questions now. And I don't think that we've got a kick out time here, so it's pretty much as long as you want to keep asking questions, I'll keep taking them. So where's Marty's going to walk around with the microphone here so we can hear everyone.
Just put your hand up and I'll run around.
You mentioned that Rage will likely ship on 2 DVDs or 1 Blu-ray. Will that scale for like Xbox 360 or portable titles if you're building them? How does something with less horsepower with your engine that generalized handle so much data?
Okay, well the source data is actually radically more than that, where if you take the original uncompressed data, a wasteland, a 128K by 128K is about 80 gigs. So we go through really serious amounts of data compression just to get it down to the point where we wind up shipping it on the 2 DVDs or 1 Blu-ray on there. So the game is segmented. We have 2 major wastelands. They're going to split across the 2 DVDs. There will be some duplication across that. I wouldn't expect I wouldn't expect that we'll wind up with an HD DVD release on it just for the packaging. We probably won't make another SKU for that. What's interesting about it is because of the way the paged virtual texturing works, all of this fits fine within a 256 meg video card. Now on the PCs, a lot of times there's extra stuff in there that may cause that not to work so spectacularly, but one of the things that's making our lives a little bit difficult on the PS3 is that our video memory requirements for texturing, for running like the game like this, doesn't even completely use the 256 megs set aside for video memory. We wish we could use some of that for other things on there. We may wind up running some of those segments of data uncompressed, get a little bit higher quality if we've got a little bit of performance to burn on there. So we could actually scale that section of things. The megatexture technology could scale down to significantly lower in video devices. And one of the things that's particularly exciting to me is that the engine goes through a fair amount of work to prioritize and schedule what it needs to load. It figures things out based on how much area on the screen is covered by things that are how many levels blurry, and it's pretty smart about how it brings things in. And some of the guys will develop at home over a VPN network, and pulling the textures all the way from our server across the VPN works surprisingly well. And I think that with the addition of just a little bit more logic to do a local cache of anything there, I think there's a great opportunity for some massively multiplayer game to have some central server with terabytes of texture data that they're just farming out as many people as they want to throw at it to build all sorts of grand things, but incrementally distributed directly through a page texture caching scheme on there, which is kind of interesting. Now, I suppose we have a level of downscaling just by the fact that we're aiming for 60 hertz on there, but the game is certainly playable at 30 hertz. So it's likely that any computer that somebody's got today, even by the time we've got Rage out, will at least be able to play the game halfway decently. PCs will always have to have more horsepower just to get over the cruft and miscellaneous things that they have to deal with there. But a lot of the things that will wind up, the texturing is very, very scalable. Geometry is still not so scalable, so you wind up being vertex limited if you go to a much slower system on there. And again, that's why I hope we can virtualize geometry in the future, but there's a number of reasons why it's a little bit harder, and we might need to go to a higher level of triangle density before we can apply certain decimation techniques automatically on there. Let's see what else on there. So I mean, performance-wise, the big thing is it does scale down quite a bit, but the texturing side of things scales almost infinitely. You could use much lower processors, and one of the pitches, for years I had been pushing virtualizing textures at the video card vendors, and they hemmed and hawed, and theoretically some of the current generations have capability of doing this, but it's not really well exposed. The insight for all of this was that, well, I can just go do it myself in software, and it winds up giving me tighter control than I would have had likely through whatever API they would have set up anyways. But one of the pitches that I made is that if you virtualize all of this and you're bringing it in a page at a time, you don't need 512 meg or 1 gig video cards. An argument could be made that you could get by with a video card with 16 meg even, just caching a few texture tiles in there, bringing those in across the PCI Express. So there's interesting aspects to that technology trade.
Mr. Carmack, since your keynote last year, Microsoft announced their XNA Game Studio Express game development platform, and then just recently Nintendo announced their WiiWare initiative to make downloadable games available for the Wii. Are you interested in making games based on both those platforms in any way, especially since you prefer making simpler games?
Honestly, we don't have any direct involvement with any of that, and there's one, I guess, sort of almost, while I'm really thrilled with our Xbox Live games on there, there's an almost selfish reason why they don't appeal as much to me for my pet projects, and that's, if you're a graphics geek programmer, a situation like that where you have an embarrassment of resources, which a 16 meg title on a 360, that's an embarrassment of resources. You have computing power coming out your ears on there, and you wind up with, to my sensibilities, a very unbalanced sort of, to do the best job possible on there, it's a weird balancing act where you wind up doing crazy things for sort of data compression and things like that, or you just leave most of the machine idle, both of which are, offensive's too strong of a word, but they don't fit my particular sense of programming aesthetics for the types of challenges that I personally like to undertake. I think it's great that there's more ways for people, especially smaller game developers and businesses. Xbox Live has really been a great success, and that's one of those things where it's good for almost everyone involved. It's good for the consumers, they get these neat little games. It's good for a lot of developers where they have something that doesn't require a 4-year development effort to roll into this. And it's been good for Microsoft, obviously. It's been a good success. So, I always thought it sounded like generally a pretty good idea, but it really succeeded beyond my expectations. And there's one, as a little anecdote to that, I always have to reconsider my positions on different things, and while I know some people will tell me that I come off as very arrogant and whatever in my proclamations on things. The truth is there's always a lot of reevaluation of things, and one of the things that I've had to take a hard look at related to that is that one of the things I bitched the most at Microsoft about was the non-openness of their networking. That I really said, as a game developer, what I want is sockets. Give me UDP and TCP packets on there, just let me go. And that's essentially what Sony's doing. But Microsoft has gone off and done something that's that is more closed, but is really good. It's easy to fall into the trap of just thinking open will always be better. But Microsoft has done almost unquestionably a good thing for gamers with the Xbox Live stuff, and it is a closed proprietary platform that I'm not particularly fond of the implementation decisions behind that, but it's still good. So that's a separate little bit.
With the virtualization, have you guys at id ever, are you guys exploring handing off that power to the players of the game? I guess the quickest analogy would be what they're doing with Little Big Planet, where you could almost think, especially if you get the virtualization working with geometry, perhaps an MMO where the players can sculpt the world that they're playing in.
We've talked about it internally. Even on the trivial level of, Tim would come in and ask me, can we use this virtualization technology to let people spray paint their cars all sorts of different ways? And there's aspects to it that could be helpful for that, but it hasn't been the force driving any of the decisions there. Really, we are trying to solve the professional content creation problem on there, and I would probably do things somewhat differently if we were aiming at something that was going to be consumer editable in all cases. Although that does remind me, it's so many things to talk about here, but to segue back from that a little bit, the sense of the mod community and user modifications. One thing that, an unfortunate conclusion that I've reached is that in terms of high-end gaming, the golden age of the mod maker really has passed. Mod making is a semi-pro activity right now, and it's wonderful what people do. It is if you want to get into the game industry, being part of a significant mod team, it means more than, certainly to us and to a lot of people, being part of something significant like that is going to do more for you than a college degree at most places short of an MIT or something. It's still a good thing, but there was a time, and most of you will remember it back in, especially in the Doom days, where everybody made their house or office or something in a little Doom editor and played around, and that level of kind of interactivity and creativity I do miss today, and it does impact the decisions that we make day to day for our current project, where we're not going to do anything to make it harder for that, but on the other hand, we're specifically not going too far out of our way to make our lives harder, to make it easier to make mods. And we're still going to, like I said, id Studio, our development environment, it comes with the game. You can pop it up. We're going to have all of this technology licensing stuff that we'll probably still make available for free to everyone. We'll dump over a lot of source code and so on, but it's tough to make games in this environment. But that does bring back yet another one of these unsigned, no contract set projects that I'm sort of pushing along here in the background. We've got, everybody's seen like the original Doom game running on a smartphone or something. It's a point of pride to me that Doom is the first thing that gets ported to everything that has a compiler and a video screen. It's just everywhere, and I think that's totally cool. But before we actually got into the mobile, doing real mobile products ourselves, usually Todd and Marty would get pestered a couple times a year with some little company coming up and saying, look, we've got Doom running on our Palm Pilot or on the iPac or one of these little things. And we're always like, yeah, that's kind of a neat demo, but you can't play this for shit here. It's a completely lousy game. And some of these people went ahead and paid us some money, and they vanished without a trace on this because it wasn't a good game. It was a technology demo. Now, we've got the same thing on some of the high-end brew phones where, EA Mobile internally, they've gone and ported Doom 2 over there to test out some various concepts, and that's free and great and wonderful. But we've talked about how could we actually make a product out of this. And of course, when I had that decision to make early on, I decided to do a completely different type of game with Doom RPG. But if we look at the sort of fast action run and gun sorts of things, it's still my opinion that there's not a good control method to do on the mobile phones with that. But I have at least some theories that I want to try researching there, that it may be possible to make an action game there where you're not directly controlling, but it's almost like you're steering an aimbot of some kinds, where it's still like you're clicking the buttons to make it do things and timing matters, but you don't necessarily have to be circle, strafe, jump, shoot, duck at the same time on the cell phone. And we could possibly, if we work this out, then yeah, we could do a Doom game or pull back, bring up all the old classics, do Heretic and Hexen and all that type of stuff on these platforms if we had a way to make them fun to play. But tying in with that is this aspect that I think could work out really, really well now, where while I think the golden age of modding has passed on the PC space, I really think that that idea of the golden age of when it was the most cool, the most applicable, the most fun, ties to a particular level of hardware power. Hardware power and connectivity to the internet to be able to communicate this to people. And a lot of the cell phones are just now reaching up into what I consider the sweet spot for doing that, where the content that you would create for that is at the level where amateurs can do it and do a good job. So I would like to see something done here where we take probably Doom-level technology there, if we can find a way to make it fun. It's got to be fun or it's not worth doing at all. But if we can work out a control scheme where we can drive the game like that, I think we can make a significant aspect of the game the fact that it is a moddable game where you can download the free level editor on your PC, make the new level, and then it's available for everyone to play on their cell phone. Because there's an inherent neatness to that. I mean, it's one thing to make something on your computer and play it, but for whatever reason, it's just a little bit cooler to be able to do that on your computer and then have it appear on your cell phone there, and then have other people play it. So I can imagine a setup where instead of the kind of random mod community or map making community that we would have before, that with a little bit of direct integration into the game there, where people can make levels, submit them, and then people have a grading system where rank it for difficulty and then quality, and then every time you start up the game you get, here's the new things since you've last played, ranked in order of quality, add your feedback here. And I think there's potentially something really neat to be done there as yet another of my little sort of skunkworks projects that I'm interested in pursuing. Next.
I was wondering what hardware you're running in your own personal computer.
my home system is wretchedly out of date because I really only use it for email on there. It's an ancient system. My work system is, it's a dual processor, probably like a 3.2. It's not an absolutely modern there. I do have a G80 NVIDIA card in it. I try to avoid doing that sometimes where I try to lock down my system at the beginning of a project because if I keep that, it keeps me honest through it because there's a temptation, especially when you get free hardware sent to you all the time, to always have the very latest and greatest, and it gives you a distorted sense of the performance of your current title. And I used to be able to stick to that on the shorter cycles where I start at the beginning, I don't upgrade my machine through the entire process, but now with 4-year development cycles, I usually do wind up getting an upgrade sometime in the middle, but I explicitly try to stay away from bleeding edge. There was like a particular reason why I wound up upgrading the G80 at some point, but it's not my normal practice to kind of stay up there at the very high end. Next.
Hey, so with both big software company or processor companies having a stated interest in ray tracing, and with the obvious success of Quake 4 ray trace with Intel, just wanted to know what your stance on that is.
Well, my pet idea, and it's an idea that I've had for years, so it's easy to imagine it not being exactly working out, but for random reasons, I did revisit it a little bit earlier this year, and it still seems credible to me. I've never been a big proponent of like classical ray tracing hardware, and I know there was a ray trace board a few years ago that people asked me about, and I panned it as saying I don't think that's the right direction for things to go, because casting classical rays against polygonal geometry or classic spherical, any of the normal ray trace primitives, I don't think that has a whole lot of strong benefits. But the exact thing that I think has some real potential is a sparse octree voxelization of the world, where you wind up with, if you take essentially the textures that we've got covering everything, if you've got those as a surface octree where instead of having the world be filled as a volume, if you've really only got a skin for it, and if you represent that by starting off with the entire world enclosed in something, you octree voxelize it down, where there's all these clever little bit level things where it turns out that to be able to represent voxel level geometry at the texel densities, the tasks that they like to do on there, the trade-offs on different things, when you run into Amdahl's wall on the different things, and vertexes and fragments do a pretty amazing job on the amount that we've scaled over it and with it, and I do not feel close to the limits of what we can do with vertex and fragment shaders on here, where there was definitely an uncomfortable time during Doom's development where you could tell we are right at the uncomfortable limits of fixed function hardware, where you've only got these few basic things you can do there. But what we can do with current level vertex fragment stuff, I don't think we're anywhere near tapping that out. So I don't think it's right necessarily to have this hell-bent rush to abandon classical graphics accelerators for a completely general processor architecture. And I know that's Sony was originally thinking that they could head that way, maybe have 2-cell processors and no GPU, and I mean that would have been a bullet in the brain sort of mistake for this generation of consoles, and they realized it before they went too far down. And I stand by that. I mean, for all these reasons why I think physics is hard to scale in the quality of a game, to make a game more valuable because of physics acceleration. It's a challenging problem, and I don't think a plug-in card could solve this for you here. But they are moving towards this direction of being a very high-performance general compute resource that could theoretically compete in this, this general-purpose sea of processors, alternate rendering architectures environment there. And just like right now, you can write fragment processor code that it's a pretty easy transliteration between CG, HLSL, or GLSL. I mean, all of these are C-like sorts of things. And I see the same thing happening with these flexible, highly threaded processor accelerations. They're all going to have their different architectures, but hopefully they're all going to be close enough that you can have one sort of application that can run across all of them to let people kind of see how these things are really panning out.
I wanted to say thank you very much for open sourcing the Quake 3 engine. It's made a huge difference to the community. I wanted to ask your opinion about the future of Linux and open source gaming.
I do take a great deal of personal pride and satisfaction with what I've been able to do with getting so much of the stuff out. And sometimes I think about it and while I know it's not something that I'm generally considered for, I may be one of the most prolific open source authors, considering all the code that I've written over the last 15 years that I've made open source or have made open source there. And I do think it's very valuable. I mean, I'm very happy when I see both user gaming community stuff or research universities or people doing simulation tests or bringing up things in, again, every new piece of hardware winds up having one of the Doom or Quake titles. They bring up test application. So I'm very happy to have done that, and it's certainly going to continue. I mean, I'm not sure, I won't commit to a date, but the Doom 3 stuff will be open source. We still make those decisions. Even today, when we're doing the Rage code, decisions about, like, do we want to integrate some other vendor's solution, some proprietary code into this? And the answer is usually no, because eventually Tech 5 is going to be open source also. This is still the law of the land at id, that the policy is that we're not going to integrate stuff that's going to make it impossible for us to do an eventual open source release. And we can argue the exact pros and cons from a pure business standpoint on it, and I could at least make some perhaps somewhat contrived cases that I think it's good for the business, but as a personal conviction, it's still pretty important to me, and I'm standing by that.
You had mentioned that the material editor had kind of been deprecated in Tech 5. Could you explain what drove that decision?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting tale about that, where, as I said when I started off post-Doom 3, figuring out the graphics stuff, I was building a very general purpose graphics framework, and I was doing things, I was reading stuff on RenderMan and Gelato and all the high-end offline renders, and realizing that you really can set up on a modern platform, you can build a real-time render along those lines that has that same degree of flexibility. You really don't have to change too terribly much, and you can make something that's credible. You can make something that you can do a good game at that could probably stand as reasonable middleware and could have this wonderful scalability all the way from running it on the console to at least making TV, if not film quality images out of it when you crank the parameters all the way up. And there's an appeal to that. And I know I talked about that a couple years ago about that there may be this possibility that the next generation graphics engine could have a lifespan like RenderMan, where it lasts for a decade or something, or 20 years on there. But what turned out is, while it's possible to still get decent enough performance there, you're still a factor of a couple off from what you do if you wind up structuring your things less general and as a game engine. And in fact, what we have right now for Rage, we have sort of the general purpose path, and then we have our fast version, where all of the stuff that's running in the tools and the normal game, you're bringing it up on the standard renderer path. Everything's done with shadow buffers, and everything is done with discrete instances of everything. And then when you're ready for it to go fast, you go ahead and run it through this process where it builds everything together, unifies all of the materials into common materials, and only cuts things up as necessary for culling granularity. And this makes about a 3x performance difference. When we were getting ready for E3, we were looking at this, the same sort of track running around. We're chugging along at, in the teens or 20 so frames per second on a lot of this, and everybody's like, I don't know how this is going to work out. But over the course of going ahead and saying, okay, we're going to go make it fast now, we brought it up to almost, we dropped frames, and it's a shame, it bugs me there, where there's two spots in this whole loop that we run through where we just dropped below 60 frames per second, and we didn't identify what was killing us until after E3, and it turns out all the surface stuff's going great, but our little scatterings of foliage on there were a surprisingly dominant factor, so we're redoing how we do foliage on there. But related to that, that kind of bringing everything together and optimizing it pass, it turns out that the entire world just about could be drawn with 3 draw calls in this, where one for land surfaces, one for non-land opaque surfaces, and one for non-land translucent surfaces. Almost everything winds up being done like that, because one of the one of the interesting things is that in addition to virtualizing the textures to let you have kind of unlimited resources, it's also the ultimate infinite atlasing system where since everything is using the same virtual texture page pool, they can all use the same material, and you can wind up taking, in this room you would have the podiums, the floors, the stands, the lights, all of these things can wind up, while they're separate models initially, move them around, you position them separately, but when you're ready to go fast, they get all built into the same model, so you've got one draw call because they all use the same virtual surface and virtual materials on there. The only reason you wind up breaking it up is for culling granularity. You really literally could have three calls that draw just about everything except for a few glowing things in the sky and the few things that are not conventional surfaces in there. But you still want to break it up so you could do culling based on visibility and frustum culling and things like that. One of the things that so that's really important for this performance, where again, we literally tripled our speed when we went to a fast path that cut out a bunch of the general purpose stuff in here. But a lot of that's only possible because everything does run with this small core common set of attributes. And at least initially, when we went out there and I was testing all these things with parallax mapping, all the Fresnel factors on the fall-offs of different environment map options on top of things, you could do all of these, no longer merge all of these surfaces together. You're left with 50 different rendering programs, which are breaking on different platforms, randomly changing as you update different things. All of these other problems of having essentially tons of different programs running these surfaces, each with their own parameterization and all that. So it works, but it has developmental issues that complicate things, and it prevents you from doing this massive merging, which is a great big speed gain on there. And the bottom line was, it was neat to play around with this, but I wasn't seeing the big win. I wasn't seeing somebody say, here's this material that we put together on here, that adding this in the game is going to make people go, wow, it's going to stand out, it's going to, it's going to make the game. And I wasn't seeing that. And the position that I've come down to is that giving the artists a powerful but fairly fixed standardized set of things and expecting 99% of the world to be done inside that, but removing the limits. You can use as much texture as you want, but you can't necessarily throw on all these multi-layer textures. Expecting most of the world to be done like that is working out well. Now, we haven't removed the ability to do anything else, but it's just turning out to be less necessary than I expected and not the right direction to push people to do things in. Next.
I noticed while playing Animator Quake Wars that the animations seem to be running at 30 hertz instead of 60, while the renderer is running at 60. Is there any reason for that? And is that going to be in the final game?
Okay, so the story about game time performance in enemy territory. Enemy territory has had significant performance problems through its development, and there's a lot of reasons for it as you kind of delve down through all the different things that are going on and the way certain decisions were made and things were implemented. And the bottom line was that the game, to get reasonable performance on the lower-end PC target platforms and the consoles, the game logic runs at 30 hertz. And that's pretty much all the game logic. Now, the earliest tests of the game went out like this, and this was all the performance they were going to get. It needs significant architectural changes and improvements to be able to kind of get past that. And there was a lot of negative feedback about locking the game at 30 for the people that had the very highest end cards. And this was, and what wound up happening was they went in and so some of the guys that were working on this, and honestly, I was really dubious, and I'm still a little queasy about the architecture here of running the render at a higher frame rate than the game logic on there. But it seems to be working fairly well. I think it seems to be a positive step for that. But it's not the direction I personally would have taken on this. I would have tried harder to make the gameplay run at a higher tick rate, but that's just kind of the way the decisions got made there. Rage is certainly running at a 60 hertz tick rate across the board.
Okay, this is kind of a multi-part question, so bear with me while I try to spell it out for you. But from Your main problem with the PS3 is the memory and the way it's split, but the general consensus is that, from what I'm hearing anyways, that it's the processors and the way they're 7 and 1 to organize it all. Yet at the same time, almost everybody in the industry is saying they're wanting to program for 4 or 8 cores and beyond. Is the processor not a problem with you, or what's going on there?
Okay, yeah, the fact that I mentioned the memory is a really obvious thing. That's not to say at this point it probably is our main developmental problem with the PS3, because we've got a pretty good handle on everything, and that's the day-to-day thing that bites us. I would say, and in years past, my original point was always that I think Microsoft's decision to use 3 symmetric dual-core processors with a unified address space was a smarter decision than Sony's decision to use 1 dual-core processor and 8 other not symmetric with the main processor, limited access, local memory acceleration processors makes life more difficult for developers. And you'll find some, in any argument with a significant number of people, you'll find somebody which will be willing to take the case of the cell is awesome, I love programming this way. There will be some people that particularly like the low-level scheduling things where you've got the ability to schedule at a resource level that you just can't do on the more kind of general-purpose Microsoft cores. But it's still my opinion, certainly, that the symmetric architecture is a much, much better design on there from a software development standpoint. And what you wind up playing, it's definitely 1 part hardware, but it's probably a couple parts software development at this side, at this point. And I think that any decision there that winds up not giving you an overwhelming hardware advantage, and it's at the expense of software development, is probably a bad call. Did you want to follow up any on that? Okay, next.
Okay, you've already talked about what you want to do with geometry as far as what you want to do with that on the development side, but on the gameplay side, what do you think is going to be possible in the near future?
Well, there's definitely sort of, the question of near future gets a little bit murky, because there are approaches that I think I would try to take if I was trying to virtualize geometry today, but I don't think the time is quite right. And that's always one of the real things about, if you're doing a good job at a strategic decision, it's often a matter of choosing when's the right time to do it. You don't necessarily pick a goal and blindly beat your head against a wall in pursuit of that goal. Sometimes it's just not the right time. And you see that all the time when somebody tries to do something that I guess at id I've always tried to do something when it's just barely possible, but you see people that try to do things when it's not yet possible, and you wind up with some kind of a dismal failure. I'm inclined to believe that geometry virtualization is at that point right now, but 4 years from now, it may be possible to do something with that. Now, what it winds up doing for gameplay is somewhat of an orthogonal question to how it can impact our game development side of things, because we can continue to do the same types of games right now, but freeing it up with infinite geometry resources and infinite texture resources, and we can make games that are much more interesting. We can set them in locales or areas that we couldn't previously because of different resource limitations, and we can do things at the simple level from gameplay like that. But that's not necessarily integrating it into the gameplay features. And this is another thing that when I was talking with Ajia about what you could do with infinite physics on things like that. And a completely destroyable world could be really cool. We were basically saying, if you took a Quake Arena game, kept the gameplay exactly the same, but you had a world set up so everything could be blown to pieces with the rocket launcher while you're playing, and you set up all the cool stuff with columns and arches and getting things to fall over and buildings to buckle and doing all of this, that would be totally cool. That's a research project all in its own right, and I think somebody should be doing that, and that's one of the things that I sort of browbeat all the physics people about. Why hasn't somebody shown us the grand vision of this game is so totally awesome because of this level of physics processing. I think it's there. I mean, people cast me as a disbeliever in physics acceleration, but I'm a believer that you can do something grand with this, and I don't think anybody's shown it to me, and I'm not likely to be the person that's going to go out and do that. I've got too much on my plate right now, but I mean, the ball is in their court to show us what can be done. I think it's out there. I think somebody can do something spectacular, but I've yet to actually see it happen.
Yeah, I saw your rocket downstairs. Can that thing reach North Korea? Or do you have any plans to make any more rockets or missiles?
Let me, I generally try to segment the rocketry stuff a little bit away because I know there's a subsection of people, and I get email from them that are like, you should just quit playing with those rockets and make more video games. But I'm heartened to hear that a lot of people thought it was fairly cool to see the rockets down here. Now, it is really interesting when you start looking at the capabilities. As a general guideline, the quad over there has the same amount of delta V, or rocket performance essentially, as Spaceship One had, where if that was lifted up to a high altitude airplane launch, it would reach 100 kilometers. The module on there, a little bit more drag, a little less mass fraction, but it's still, as a ballistic missile, it's got, it might have 50 miles range or something on there. When we were doing at last year's X Prize Cup, we have to do these calculations about how far different things could fly under there, and we're running through these numbers and kind of looking at that in New Mexico and going, this could reach Texas under these conditions, and things like that. And what is interesting about this is we are being essentially allowed to do this. We have all of the permits from the federal government to build vehicles. We've gone through the permitting process that is essentially what you need to go through, even all the way up to orbital vehicles. And it's one thing to look at how can this vehicle that we're flying here, we can reach another state with, or you start thinking, well, it could also reach Mexico, and you start thinking about international things like that. And where we're going with this, we're looking at contracts and things for building eventual orbital capable vehicles. And I do take some time to sit and marvel at the fact that in America, we're allowed and even encouraged on some level to have a few people get together in a warehouse and build a vehicle that is eventually going to be capable of, as you say, reaching North Korea or Iran or something like that. And of course, saying that, a lot of people are going to sit back and go, I never thought of that, that's really terrifying. But I think that that's a fairly positive thing. It's most countries, you don't get to do that, and there's still something to be said positive about what we've got here. So.
As a follow-up to my previous question about the logic being at 30, is there any way to make like the player animations and stuff at 60 while the vehicles at 30? Or make it an option? Because it bugs the hell out of me.
Yeah. Like I said, it already worked out better than I expected it to. I expected it to be kind of a disaster, and I'm happy to be proven wrong that it's at least something of a positive on there. I'm not deeply involved in the death march for enemy territory right now. I'm not sure what they're going to wind up doing in the future. I'm speaking out of turn, but I wouldn't think it would be ridiculous to assume that at some point, maybe in later patches or whatever, there's an option to go ahead and when everybody has faster computers to run the thing at a higher frame rate. But as it stands right now, it's not a very pretty hack, and I wouldn't really encourage people to go, hacking on top of it too much more.
Hi. Well, I think it's becoming obvious with the way bandwidth is accelerating, and we're kind of reaching the point where digital distribution is possible again, and even a viable, way. We're seeing that more and more with like director drive and all that. What's your stance on id Software personally going back to digital distribution and cutting out the middlemen, including Steam?
Well, I mean, certainly, I know we've had comments about Steam before, and honestly, I haven't followed up on all of ours about what the current deals on everything are. But yeah, at least initially, it sure did look like Steam is they take it's a different middleman. It's not cutting out the middleman when you go there. Even in that regard, there's still a lot of benefit to digital distribution. The fact that you can have your entire back catalog, you don't have to worry about buying shelf space or end caps and things like that. And it should be clear to everyone that in the internet world, you see what you want, you go click, you want it to show up, and just go get it right there. It seems completely obvious that probably the next generation of consoles won't have optical media distribution. It'll probably be a direct digital distribution on there. We've certainly at least toyed with various ideas about how we could deal with this or deal with other subcontractors to do that. But it does come down to there's a limit to the resources that we've got, and we do want to be a game development company rather than a publisher. This is a question that's come up since the very early days, and it was generally my personal position that I didn't want us to go become a publisher back when we were doing Wolfenstein or Doom, even though we had the option sort of available to us. It may or may not have worked out well for us, but it would have been a very different company, and I'm happier with it being the company that it still is rather than what that route would have taken us. So I don't think you're going to see it take on any massive infrastructural sorts of changes because, well, the idea is always that maybe you can use somebody else's server farm and all of this is just IT work, but there's a lot more to it than that. Steam's not as easy as it looks, and there is a lot of expertise that goes into that there, and I don't think we want to build that up internally.
I had a question about the other games that are coming to Steam. Quake 1 and Quake 2, are those GL Quake? And have any big changes been made to maybe let it run in a higher resolution than the regular engines?
I honestly don't know exactly what's been done there. I mean, the first mention, when Todd was mentioning about all of these run on Vista and everything, I'm kind of curious exactly what they did for all of that because I haven't been a part of that, and that's neat if that all works. But so no, I can't tell you any specific things that have gone on in this. But as far as Quake and so on, there, I would encourage you to poke around on what people have done with source ports on the source code because I know there've been a lot of work of kind of modernizing and fixing things up on some of that aspects. And yeah, I look at that when, in fact, just this last week, somebody at the id office was running Quake 1. I look by and you see the teeny tiny little status bar centered in the screen on there. Yeah, it's tempting to even go spend a couple hours and just clean up some of that, but I have more pertinent things to do.
With the introduction of the .NET framework by Microsoft, and with them getting into 3.0, 3.5, where do you see this going in game development with natively compiled C and C++ code?
We don't use any managed code. Now, one significant aspect is we're cross-platform. We want to work on the Mac and the PS3. I should not make any kind of a judgment on the .NET frameworks because I haven't worked with them enough to really have a valid opinion about it. But I do think that in a lot of things, Microsoft does a very good job on their software engineering. By the time they've gotten to a version 3.0, very often they're the best in the business. And that Microsoft does this on all sorts of different things where their initial foray into it is not very good or even bad, and then they incrementally work it out. It's a valid business strategy which has made them the most successful software company in the world, so you can't deride it too much. But the truth is, after they've gone through a few versions, it's usually pretty damn good. But for our specific, because of the nature of our development and our cross-platform goals and aims, we're not going to be tied specifically to a Microsoft framework like that. So it's really just not even on the table as an option for us.
This question is sort of in reference to something else that already was asked about open source. And you mentioned Doom 3 being open source eventually, and the same for idTech 5. And I had heard rumors that you guys licensed Havoc systems for your future game. I don't know if this is true. This is just rumor. And I was wondering if that would interfere with open source for idTech 5 and physics systems.
Well, that's the problem with rumors, is they're often wrong. No truth to that rumor whatsoever. What had happened that probably spawned the rumor was Raven had made the decision for Quake 4 to take out our fairly simple internal physics engine and replace it with Havoc. They had our blessing to do that. I didn't think it was a good idea at the time. I still don't think it was a good idea, and I think they probably agree with me, having gone through it. So no, there's no intention for us to be integrating Havoc with any of our core code bases.
Let's see, sorry, just a moment. On VR headsets, when it comes to first-person shooters, one of the problems with head tracking is that you can't separate your aiming system and your gun from the head, the free look. Ideally, you would have mouse control over the gun, and you could still look to your left while you're not aiming to the left.
Yes.
And I know with Rage, you're going to be doing some driving, and it's more common with driving games and flying games that you have that free look capability. And I'm wondering if you've made any considerations to the first head.
I can't say we've even really brought up the issue of head-mounted displays on here, where, as I've said before, I am a proponent of significant new I/O devices, and I'd love to see that reach a level of maturity where where it's common enough for us to make an issue out of it. But we certainly haven't even discussed that as coming up as an issue. I did mention this in Rage, but we do have the multiplayer aspect of it. We are supporting co-op on there, whether it's driving, head-to-head. I should mention specifically about co-op, where we've known for a long time now that co-op it's a wonderful sort of play mode. And in Doom 3, early on at the beginning, we really wanted to do a great co-op mode on that, but as the game got later and later, more and more over budget, it never got the time devoted to it. But we know that that's still a really great way of doing things. So Rage is going to have co-op head-to-head racing and also gunner on top of car co-op for driving around, which would be a lot of fun. It probably won't have a standard conventional deathmatch, although I'm sure we'll have enable these console variables, and you'll have some vestigial mode there that we use for testing things. But as far as other alternate movement methods, we still have a lot of testing with the exact combat mechanics of driving and gunning at the same time. I don't think what we've got in there right now is going to be what's final, so there's quite a bit more development yet to be done on that side of things.
This is a two-part question. You mentioned when Rage ships, you're looking at putting it on either 2 DVDs or Blu-ray disc. Is there a reason why either you are or are not considering HD DVD? And the second part of the question is, if it does come down to Blu-ray disc, does that have any judgment on your thoughts of the PS3, since PS3 is the biggest hardware proponent for Blu-ray?
I'm actually fairly agnostic personally on the Blu-ray versus HD DVD. I'm not an extreme videophile. My eyesight's failing me. That level of I'm not a videophile like that. So I don't have a strong personal preference on it. For us, it's really a matter of if there's Blu-rays in the PS3, it's less distribution cost for us, although I believe the Blu-ray still costs more than 2 DVDs, although don't hold me to that. It's at least not a completely radical difference there. As far as distributing on an HD DVD, there's no reason why we couldn't. I just think it's probably not the right thing from a retailer standpoint, inventory management, and all of that. If it was a 5 DVD game, then we might consider putting it onto a couple HDs, but even there, it probably comes down to a cost of goods issue, where if it's going to cost the same or more for an HD DVD, it's the extra confusion in the retail channel, worrying about somebody picking up the wrong version. And we went through all of this years ago in the transition from CDs from floppies to CDs and from CDs to DVDs. Usually the transition on distribution media comes later than you would expect it to, and there's fairly decent reasons for why that's so.
Hi, I have a question about Rage. You said it's going to be multi-platform, PC, Xbox, and PS3. Well, what is your view on cross-platform play, like games for Windows Live? I know Epic has recently denied it for Unreal Tournament 3, and I was wondering what your position on that was.
You mean playing from one platform to another platform?
Yeah, from console to PC.
Okay, I am not a proponent of that for some specific reasons. While it's technically possible, and you can, especially if you're in a client-server architecture or something like the Quake 3 model of things, you could reasonably sort of do that. But it's a technical, gimmicky sort of thing that I don't think expanding your user base or your opponent base across that is worth the technical headaches and hassles that you've got there. The increased put over that technically it really shouldn't be that big of a deal, but in practice, all the things about testing all the different permutations of that, worrying about errata in some platform, how it's going to impact the other things, and just making your development platform handle all of that. With the unified code base, it would be a better bet. We could make it work, but it's certainly not a goal of mine. And given that there are a million things in game design that we do have to do that are still hard and problematic, that is one of those things that I just it comes up. We bring it up and we at least toss the idea out every time we do a game, and I kick it right back off and say we have 100 things that are more important to worry about, so that's just not going to be a priority.
I know after the release of Doom 3, you ran into and were a bit disappointed by a patent debacle with Creative over your implementation of stencil shadow volumes. I wonder if in the 3 years since then, with the expansion and the advancement of technology, if you've run into technology licensing issues like that, and if so, what you've done about it.
We have had a few sort of patent threat things that come up to us. There have been a few people that have been going around the industry essentially sending threat letters to everybody that does video games over a couple different patents. We haven't been specifically targeted on anything in recent times. And it's something that it's a really big issue with that, and it is one of those things that I could imagine being one of those things that that could drive me out of the industry on there, because it affects me on a personal level like that. I'm just so troubled by this sense that in the specific case of the Doom 3 stuff, it was something that I was sitting there working a problem. I came up with a good solution. I even had documentation along the whole way of the approaches I was taking, how I was trying to do this, and I was happy with my solution. But then to, at the end, see that some other equally good programmer followed that same path, wound up, hit the same solution a month before I did, filed a patent for it, to then say that idea is now off limits. I find it fairly reprehensible, and I don't think that it's a positive thing for the industry or the country or anything, having this sort of intellectual land grab that the patents often apply on there. And the truth is, it's a shambles. It's a sham, because all modern products of any complexity are infringing on lots of patents, and that's just the fact of the matter. Any significant product, if you trolled through the patent database, you would be able to find patents that somebody could make a fair case in a legal court that a product infringes on. And I heard, at a to be unnamed video card company, at one time, one of the high-ups was basically saying the rule is our engineers are not allowed to look at the patent database ever. They just go do their job, and we will deal with it as it comes. So this is not what the Patent Office was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about preserving, distributing knowledge so it would be a positive, growing thing. And it's not what it is today. And while in general I'm an optimist about all sorts of things, about our industry, society in general, all of these things, the Patent Office is one of those things that I can't say I'm incredibly optimistic about, and if I spent too much time thinking about it, I could probably get rather depressed about it, because it's one of those things that's supported by cadres of lawyers, and lawyers become lawmakers, and I can't quite imagine huge sweeping reform coming over, whether it's patents or general tort reform, or a lot of these things that that have the legal profession intertwined in amongst things here. It's hard for me to think really positive about that. But in general, the world goes on, and it winds up being a parasitic tax on those of us that are doing productive things.
When I compare today's speech to, say, back in '98 when we were sitting on the floor talking about radiosity lighting at the Infomart, I can't help but think that over time you've become more of the savvy business person in addition to your endeavors in programming. And I was wondering, how has your experiences in the business world colored your opinions on where technology is going and your opinions on frameworks and such?
Well, you might get some arguments from people about that. Considering that I've put $3.5 million into my rocket ship company, so we'll see when that. I do expect that to pay off. I mean, I'm going to have a lot of big "I told you so"s when I turn $10 million out of that. But I do specifically class myself. A lot of people, like when I go to various places, sometimes people try to tag me as an entrepreneur, and I'm not. The tag that I use on myself is an engineer. And while I could see elements of all of these things from scientist, researcher, businessman, whatever, at my heart, I feel that I'm an engineer. I use technology to produce something of value, and that's what I derive my rewards from. Business-wise, it would be hard for me to make a really strong, straight-faced argument that that all of some of these little crusades and pet projects that I'll go on are necessarily the hard-nosed business decisions. But I can certainly point to a lot of things that we've done pretty good. We've followed a lot of the things that I feel are important, and some of the little wild hair things that I'm doing now with mobile gaming are turning out to be profitable. But I don't ever look at things from, here's how we should go out and do estimate this market and decide we want to go into this for a strategic reason. Specifically in the mobile stuff, where we could sit back and try and say we've made the corporate decision that this is a growth market. We're going to go into here and establish an early beachhead presence and grow it, blah blah blah. But I told this last year. The story of the mobile stuff was I got a new phone and I said these games are crap. How hard can it be to make a mobile game? And no, that's not the hard-nosed businessman making a corporate strategy decision there. So yeah, I think that if somebody was trying and optimized its software, a business optimized its software, might have gone somewhat differently. I mean, I'm sure it would have gone somewhat differently than as it has with me as one of the key driving forces here. But again, we've done pretty good, and I'm not unhappy with where we've wound up. So, next.
You had talked about how decreasing latency latency between the mouse and keyboard and what you see on the screen being perhaps the next big thing, or at least improving. And you'd also mentioned that we might be seeing like 3 megapixel screens in the future. I sort of felt like you said 640K memory is enough for anybody when you said that we may be seeing 3 megapixel screens. Do you feel that we're kind of topping out with resolution and that we need to be looking at other avenues like latency between the mouse?
I think it's actually very interesting that in many ways now we are within small integral factors of all that matters. And I went through this again just this last year in terms of frame rate and and motion blur and some of these things where we went and at one point I had a little cut down version of the Rage stuff that we could 30 hertz, 60 hertz, 120 hertz, or 240 hertz internally. And part of that comes as a result of the way the Xbox 360 works with predicated tiling. If you're trying to render a 720p screen with 4, it's broken up into 4 separate little screens on there, rendered and combined together. So I had the idea that maybe we can go ahead and instead of rendering 4 quads of the screen, we can render 4 versions of the full screen, stepping in time between them and get like real accurate everything motion blur, not a kind of fakeish motion blur like we have some various fakeish kinds of motion blur, but to do a real sample at 240 hertz rather than at 60 hertz. And I went and I implemented this little thing, so it's a trivial level, so we could go ahead and test it like that. And I had learned this before back in the Quake 3 days when I did some motion blur tests with pre-rendered movies, since we weren't that fast back then to be able to do that. But the truth is, rendering at much higher than 60 hertz, it'll vary from person to person, but for the vast majority of people, there's a good step between 30 hertz and 60 hertz. Going to 120 hertz on there is almost imperceptible. For serious, hardcore Quake players on there, there certainly are people that would run 120 hertz monitor CRTs and run Quake Arena like that. So it can make a difference at the very high end, but we are clearly within a factor of a couple of all that matters in terms of update rate. Now, in terms of resolution, you can also do similar tests there, where you can sit there at a given point, run the game, and without, if you've got enough horsepower, you can do the tests of changing between the number of samples, rendering at any given resolution. And it's not quite the same as changing the monitor resolution, but we have the ability to change the resolution of our render target, which then gets rescreen resolution. And it's amazing how many pixels we're rendering right now, even today at 720p, that really don't matter. And I had these little things where I'd be running around in the demo and you could plus and minus 10% on this back buffer resolution size, and you could knock go plus or minus 20%, nobody notices. You could go all the way down to 50%, and then you're like, yeah, it's looking a little blurrier there. So I would say that from an immersive standpoint on there, we're probably already past that. But again, I don't have the best eyesight. There are going to be people that do have much crisper eyes that sit a little bit away from a monitor and say, yeah, 1080p really does look twice as cool as 720p on there. But I don't think anybody's going to be saying that the monitors that go that much higher are going to provide a better visual experience. What you get there is when you're moving your focal point around, when you're looking at dense detail as you scan across a page. And that brings me back to one of my pet things, that I'm looking forward to direct retinal scanning, direct retinal laser imaging on there, because right now we are rendering more pixels than your eye needs. I mean, a lot more. What's going into your monitor over the DVI cable is more data than what's coming out of your retinal nerve and going into your brain. It's just we scan around and focus differently. When we have the ability to start picking and choosing our render targets like that and say, let's render only the foveal pixels and spread out in different stochastically sampled patterns as the rest of the eye is going, we can render enough pixels right now to cover everything that we need. So the extreme high monitor resolutions like that, now I don't think that those are going to have drastic impacts on kind of the feel of gaming or what we're doing with that.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about science and video games, about your love for science, and about how that's manifested in the development of video games, and if you think we're doing a good job across the nation in teaching pure science to kids.
Funnily enough, just Wednesday, I went over to kind of a spur-of-the-moment sort of decision to do this, but there was a panel on science education, and there was Anusha Ansari, who was one of the last space tourists, the lady that flew up to the space station, is local here in Dallas at Proteus Systems, and she had gathered together a big panel of people, NASA people, space people, IMAX directors, different Hollywood people, and a lot of educators, Texas educators, national educators, and we sat around and we talked about this for quite a bit. And it was an interesting discussion on a lot of things, where my position is that I don't really think we're doing a spectacular job with the schools and educations, but I'm not sure that it's all that critically important, because what's miraculous about the world today is that we are putting almost the sum total of human knowledge and experience at the fingertips of children, and this is going to be really important. I mean, I am so much smarter and more effective with the internet than I was without. I mean, it's a drastic difference. I mean, I was a self-taught rocket scientist more or less over the internet, and this is available to everyone. So I'm an optimist. I look at these things and I say, this is marvelous. It'd be easy to get bogged down in how crappy some of the schools are and how poor they serve us, or how little this winds up affecting people, but there's plenty of smart kids being born right now. It's the richest environment ever in history for them to be born into, and I expect fantastic things from science and technology as we're going forward. And yeah, it's all fascinating. In jumping around the internet, I can find stuff to just be, read some some pipeline scientists blog about doing pharmacological research in different things, and it's all exciting and wonderful, and it really does make me feel good about the possibilities for things. And I do joke about this fact that I'm like, okay, conquer video games, and we're going to go conquer space. I think maybe next I'm going to do fusion reactors, and something like that. It's all interesting.
What is your opinion on the trend towards more and more CPU cores in PCs and how that's going to affect the 3D games? Do you think it's kind of hit a point of diminishing returns at 2 cores, or do you think it's really going to benefit in the long run?
There's some specific points there. I mean, how I feel about it is, unfortunately, it's inevitable. It's not what you would choose. If you had the ability to just kind of lay out, here's the processor architecture that I'd love to have, it's one unbelievably fast central processor. There are no programming benefits to having multiple processors. It's all downhill from the first processor on. But it is inevitable. This is just a fact of life in physics and the way processors work. The only way we're going to continue to get greater and greater processing power is through parallelization in various ways. And I do come back to the point about the vertex fragment processor orientation is so far and away the most successful architecture at using parallel processors. It's not even close. So there's a distinct sort of tipping point with processor count where at smaller numbers, say 8 processors or less, you will generally wind up doing coarse-grained by hand parallelization of things. That's often a pipeline parallelization and a subsystem level parallelization, where we say, okay, we've got the game code running here, we've got the render running here, we've got the decompression logic running here, we've got AI logic running here, and you can spread this out a reasonable number of times. But there is a point, generally, when you get past 8 processors, where you start to have to look at it, instead of as the processor that does this, look at a sea of processors that you distribute your work over, and it takes a different programming style for that. And it's something that we talk about at the office on a reasonably common basis, that we know that we're going to have to take this step to. We can talk about parallelizing the rendering stuff. I can go do that. There's no problems with working that out, figuring out great things to do on the rendering side of things. The scary thing is talking about how we're going to parallelize all of the game code. And enemy territory is a good point. The game code dominated the performance there. And some of it's just the way you focus on it. As a graphics programmer, you're automatically a performance programmer, and you tend to focus on performance from the very beginning, while game programmers tend to focus on functionality, and performance winds up being something that, at the end, we'll optimize it, make it faster. And we can get the factor of 2 back by just changing the focus on all of that. But we all know that if we want to step into this next generation, we're going to have to parallelize all of those aspects. And none of this is the type of thing where you say, this is, an NP-complete super difficult problem that's just not going to be solvable. It's solvable, but it's going to take a lot of work, and as with all of these things, it's going to add to the entropy of game development. Game development will be harder when you've got parallelized multi-core stuff doing all of the work there, because we're asking more and more from an architecture that's harder and harder to deal with. And we're going to continue to do it. I mean, the industry, this is very competitive. We have a lot of smart people, hardworking companies that are working on all of this. When somebody does have the option of saying, we're going to go take this step, we're going to do this hard thing, and hopefully it's going to win and we're going to kill all of our competitors in sales there. So it's going to happen. And the interesting and exciting thing is, and we're seeing this in graphics, and we're going to see it, we're seeing it in physics simulation, and we're going to see it in parallelization, is the commercial industry out here and the games industry, which some people will still even look down their nose a little bit at, is going to rocket past all of the traditional research institutions that have been done in higher ed, where you talk about how you parallelize problems and doing that. We're not going to talk about and study it, we're going to go do it, and we're going to learn a lot along the way, and there will be a lot of people that make catastrophic mistakes, but there's going to be enough people heading out there and doing it that it'll get done. But it's not going to be in some ways, it'll have its degree of entertainment, but from someone from someone doing it, it might be kind of fun. From a technical manager's standpoint, it's going to be kind of a nightmare.
Yes, I was wondering, since the new id engine is going to be supporting PS3, 360, PC, and Mac, are you going to be supporting DX10 either in the future or currently? Is Rage going to be running DX10 to the PC, or will it be scalable to DX9?
Okay, right now on the PC and Mac, we're running OpenGL. So on the PC, it's possible, we tossed this around, there's two questions to answer on the PC platform. One is, do we want to be Vista only? And then the other is, do we want to port to DX10? Now there's no DX10 feature which is going to be driven in Rage because we run on all these other platforms that don't have, like, I can think of something useful to do with the geometry processor on there. I was never a big fan of adding this new block of processing logic in there. I think it kind of wrong-headed decisions birthed that. But I mean, when the hardware is there, we'll figure out something useful to do with it. But we're not going to make any of those centerpieces of our current technology because the hardware that's in the 360 and the PS3 are not DX10 class hardware. But the honest truth is there's nothing there that I'm just dying to get my hands on. As I said before, I don't feel that we're anywhere close to tapping out the potential of just Vertex fragment programmers inside a DX9 class hardware platform.
I'm sorry. Modern games like Supreme Commander have been running to the 2 gigabyte of addressable memory per application wall. Is there anything that it is doing to address that and avoid them, or you're going to be supporting 64 bits with IDTech 5?
We run into that problem all the time. Our artists with the render bump utility, where you take the high poly models, low poly ones, we keep bumping into the address space issue on there. And initially we had one of the guys go off and port over to Windows 64, but whenever I would say, does it work? It's always hemming and hawing. I never got the really straight answer of when we could deploy it. Right now it looks like there's a very good chance the Mac version is going to be 64-bit only, because it looks like all the Mac platforms that we're going to care about running on are 64-bit capable. And for the Mac compilers on there, for a lot of cases, the 64-bit code is actually a little bit faster. Now, that's far from a general rule, because you can wind up losing more on cache utilization from pointer bloat than you wind up getting back from any other things. But using the clean register utilization on x86 helps out there. So I think we're going to wind up having a 64-bit only version for the Mac, and we'll probably wind up using that for some of the tools.
Do you plan on putting voice over IP when the game, when Enemy Territory Quake Wars actually launches?
Say again?
Will you put voice over IP in the game when Enemy Territory Quake Wars actually launches?
Voice over internet. Oh. I don't actually know. I'm not the right person to ask on that. There should be a ton of splash damage people around, or Kevin or John Paul or one of the people that's really in that project to ask. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that.
Hi. Going back to OpenGL, the future, and portability, are you in any way involved in the development of OpenGL 3.0 or OpenGL LM?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that, because while I've been a really big booster of OpenGL over the years, and I do consider it one of my significant accomplishments in the industry, I think, was getting Apple to adopt OpenGL and being the significant force that has kept OpenGL important on a lot of vendors' screens, because I think it is important to not fall into a monoculture. But the honest truth is, I think that DX9, at least as I use it on the Xbox 360, is a better API than OpenGL right now. I mean, OpenGL has all the hidden state stuff about setting something, and it uses the currently bound one while you talk directly to objects in DX9, and I just think that it winds up being a little bit better there. I mean, we still use OpenGL on the PC, somewhat out of inertia, somewhat because of portability to the Macintosh, and at least initially to the PS3 platform before we started pulling that out and going more kind of direct low level on there. I've been on and off the different ARB boards over the years, and it's a little frustrating sometimes on there, just the character and the makeup of the people that are on there. I talk with a number of people that are involved with it on different levels. I suppose it wouldn't be that difficult to make me feel guilty about not being more involved with it, but I am pretty busy on a lot of other things, and it just hasn't been too high up on my priority list, and it probably should be somewhat higher. I do find it worthwhile that OpenGL ES seems to have taken by default the low-end sort of embedded market on there. I think that's a positive sign. And some of what's been going on with the sort of the Kronos Group stewardship of some of that is sending it in fairly reasonable directions. And it's probably better that they're pushing on it a lot more than somebody old from Evans and Sutherland sitting on the ARB that doesn't have any current relevance for what we do. But I'm not deeply involved in. There gets to be politics involved in the ARB and all that. I tune out pretty quickly when all that comes up. So I'm not as involved as I probably should be.
With the overall growth of the industry, I think it's opens itself up to new innovation. Along those lines, I was wondering what your personal thoughts were with the introduction of pay-to-play tournaments being brought online, where the winners are paid out, cash prizes through structured payouts.
I mean, that's really more of a social question than I tend to delve into, but as a general response, I think things like, I generally look pretty favorably upon things like that. It becomes a little bit tough from a business standpoint about who has the right to do what it says in the EULAs. As a concept, the idea of pay-for-play tournaments and cash payouts, I think is a great thing. I always think money's a great motivator for people, and it puts the real risk into things. You're not going to bleed and die in the tournament, but if it's coming out of your pocketbook, it does put a certain frisson to the experience there. But there could very well be a legal business issue that Todd's over there someplace, having something that to complain about. As a general concept, yeah, I think that type of thing is great, but there may be business or legal ramifications to some of it that I'm not aware of.
Are there? Yeah, I was just curious about how shadow rendering is handled in Intake 5.
Okay, there's some interesting technical sides of this where when I started off the new generation technology, it was a pure shadow buffer renderer, and you could at least initially choose between lots of different sampling parameters and levels. And the conclusion I reached was 4-tap sampling is acceptable, not spectacular. 16-tap looks great in most cases, where you can always find a pathological case of a steep, an obliquely viewed triangle where you just stretch a lixel across too much screen space. But I was generally okay with that. But again, this was one of those things, I thought I could make that all work at 30 hertz, but it wasn't going to work at enough samples at 60 hertz on there. So we've got hybrid approaches going on. And in many ways, I'm saddened in some ways by the fact that I went from a completely wonderful uniform solution in Doom 3 where everything was treated identically, and I am putting in more and more of the sort of classic game design techniques or hacks, depending on how you look at them. The outdoor lighting on the landscapes is pre-generated shadowing on there. And there's an interesting data point on there. Again, in many ways, enemy territory served as a beta test for a lot of concepts for where we're going. In that early on in enemy territory, we had data stored in such a way that we could do this cool stuff and move the sun around and change the time of day. And it made for an awesome tech demo. People love doing this, like let's move the sun around and change the sky and move all the shadows and everything. But the conclusion that we reached is that you can't make a good-looking level that's going to look good at arbitrary times of day. The exact placement of the lights and shadows is really important. So locking down a time of day is essentially necessary to make a maximally good-looking game on there. And once you decide that, then you start pushing hard for pre-generating the lighting on there. Dynamic objects are done with what we call dim shadows, where it's not a general shadow buffer solution, but it's a render of the dynamic object into a buffer that gets Gaussian blur projected on back and filtered up and just dimming down the area there. And you can see that as an artifact if you go and squint at the stuff. When a car drives into a shadowy area, the car shadow is not the same darkness as the pre-generated shadow, and it gets a little bit darker inside there. But it's a livable thing for the type of game we're doing. We're not doing an optical simulation. It's a video game. The And what we do have the ability then is we can step up certain quality, and the pre-generated lighting on there, they've got, when they're building it with the tools, and again, if you see the tool demo, Matt will probably show some of this, you can choose what quality of lighting you want for your dynamic generation. You can have single point sample on there, and you can go all the way up to like 100 stochastically sampled, jittered rays, which does get you some of the neat things that as a graphics geek you can point out and say, look, the umbra spreads on here, it's tight up next to the occluder, and it spreads out to a fuzzy shadow out here, but it's not all that important. And the one thing that I do still need to do is a good radiosity solution across the world, because we have ambient cube lighting on there, but that's one of the not so great looking sides of things, and I certainly need to just get back and do a better solution on there. Internally, I'm still not 100% positive how the interior is going to work out, where on the PC, it's still going with all the shadow buffer solutions, but I don't think we're going to be able to hit 60 like that. So I think we're going to wind out with a combination of pre-generated lighting and then dynamic object dim shadow projections.